He took the spoon again and he put it back into the bucket and he pulled it back out again and he put it up to my lips and he said, "And the sun," and he put it down my throat, and it was just so refreshing. "2020 was a bad year for a lot of people, but it was particularly a bad year for me. Didn't realize that I had sepsis poisoning, and I collapsed from sepsis poisoning in my home, and I wasn't found for 5 days. And when the police finally got to me and the emergency personnel, they rushed me to the hospital, but my organs were failing. And when I got to the emergency room, I had very serious sepsis poisoning throughout my body, and it was damaging my organs. And I died twice, according to the emergency room doctor, and they had to bring me back twice. And when that happened, I had an experience that changed my life, completely changed my life. And a lot of people tell me now, you just had a medical delusion or something of that nature. And I tell them, I said, I know the difference between, dream state or medical delusion and something that was very real, something where I could use my 5 senses, so to speak. When I died, it's like my back was on the ceiling, if that makes any sense, in the emergency room. And I was looking down on my body, and I was laying there, and the doctor and the nurses were frantic. And the doctor was getting those paddle things ready. And another nurse had this oxygen thing that was on my face, and she was squeezing like this bulb. And this other nurse had a needle, and she put it into my arm. And the doctor said, clear. And I watched my chest rise up on the gurney. The first time that happened, I was instantly taken into a spherical tunnel. It was really bizarre. It was like about 20 by 20, up from the bottom up to the side to side. It was about 20 feet. Okay, I'm trying to gauge it. Seemed like it was about that far. And the inside of that tunnel was showing a film on the walls of my life. And as I'm traveling through this tunnel, I'm seeing things that I've never seen before. But they were all pleasant things from my life. Like when I was 3 years old, my father apparently bought me one of those little metal cars. We're talking about 1960, so that was, quite a while back. But he bought me this metal car for the sidewalk, and he put me in it, and it was one of those little metal cars you could pedal. And I'm watching this on the wall of this spherical tube, I guess you could say, that I'm in. When I got back from all of this, I asked my sister, I said, did, Dad buy me a little car or something, My older sister confirmed it. She said, yeah, he bought that for your 3rd birthday. And I didn't know. I mean, I completely had forgotten about that. And there it was, in this. So I'm traveling through this tube, and the further I get along, the worse I'm feeling. I don't know if it was a sepsis or what, but I feel like the pleasantness of the life that I'm looking at, through the years, 8, 9, 10, 11, 14, 15, moving through. I'm seeing different things that I did and pleasant moments in my life, a girlfriend, this, that, or the other, moving right through, and my children being born, as I get into my 20s and my 30s, just really pleasant things. But oddly enough, my soul, which I'm assuming that's what was traveling, it felt really thirsty and dry. I don't know why, but that's the way I felt. And when I got to where I was about 60 years old, there was this huge white, it was a light at the end of this tunnel. I should point that out. And when I finally got to that light, I was about 60 years old in the sphere, and this giant veil got pulled away. Whoosh. This is going to sound weird, but I was laying in the mud, and I could smell the earth. I'm laying in the mud on my back, and I'm looking up into the sky. And it was a sky that I had never seen before. The colors, I've never seen colors like that. Those colors, you can't find them here in this realm. The colors were unbelievable. And I was in somebody's left arm, and they had me in their left arm, and I was laying on my back, and this person lifted me up enough to where I was really, really not feeling well, my soul. And this person looks over at me, and it's Jesus Christ, and he's got me in his arm. And he's got this wooden bucket there. It's like like a bucket you'd use to maybe mop a floor, but it was wooden. And he had a wooden spoon, like a big spoon too. And he dipped it into this bucket, and he poured the water down my throat. And he said, "In the name of my Father." And he poured it down my throat. And then he took the spoon again, and he put it back into the bucket. And he pulled it back out again, and he put it up to my lips, and he said, "And the Son," and he put it down my throat. And it was just so refreshing. It's hard to explain, but all of a sudden I'm feeling completely refreshed. And he puts it in again, and this time he takes the spoon and he pours it over my head. And he said, "And the Holy Spirit." And he pours it over my head, and I could feel the water running down my face. And the only way to explain this, I don't know if you've ever seen The Grinch That Stole Christmas at holiday time, where his heart grew 50 times. That's the way I felt. My heart my whole body was just enveloped with love. And I looked over into his eyes, and I could see that he was the love, so much love and compassion in his eyes. And I felt so blessed. And he lifted me up, and I was standing next to him, and he was wearing I tell people this and they think, I'm nuts, but he was wearing just a regular robe you would see in Judea. It wasn't full of adornments or anything, or gold or anything like that. And he had a rope tied around his waist, and he had sandals on, and it looked like the Jesus we know. And I found a picture of it, believe it or not, of that same face. Because when I got back, I looked and looked. Man, I researched, because I wanted to see his face. I wanted to find it, because there's been so many different variations of Christian churches that have showed his face. And I finally found it. I looked to my left, and there's this giant field, and the field was full of flowers, and it was like a rolling hills. Those hills were just rolling and rolling, and miles of it. I couldn't see into the distance, and those flowers smelled so good. And I've never seen flowers like that before, ever. I don't know where in the world you would find them. There were gorgeous colors. Again, colors you would never see here in this realm. I've never seen anything like that before. And amongst all the flowers, there were thousands and thousands of people. And I didn't know who they were, because they were kind of off in the distance. But I looked to my left, there was just one. There was this giant angel, and he had huge white wings. And when I say huge, I mean big. They were gorgeous white wings. And he had a blonde hair. He had long blonde hair. And he was smiling at me. And I thought, boy, who's that? So I asked Jesus. I said, "Jesus, who's that?" And he said, "That's Michael." And I said, "Michael who?" And he said, "That's my archangel, Michael." And he had a breastplate on, and he had vestments, and on his ankles he had those shin guards, I guess you could say, type things. And He had a long sword, but it was sheathed. What really stood out to me were the wings, how glorious they were. I mean, they were white and they were so big and so beautiful. They were pure white, not tarnished at all. They were so shiny and beautiful. I try to explain that, but in that realm, everything is different. It's really strange. And I asked Jesus, I said, who that was. And he said, Michael. And he said, that's who brought you here. And I looked at him and I said, what? And he said, yeah. And I said, is this heaven? And he said, yes, it is. And I said, Jesus, I said, I don't know if I belong here. I was a sinner, I said, I sinned every day. I don't think I'm worthy to be here. I'll be honest with you. And I was serious about it. I felt kind of guilty. I thought I was I felt like I was stealing something or something, like, what am I doing here? Who am I? So I told him, I said, Jesus, I don't think I'm worthy to be here. You probably should have sent me to that other realm. There is one. I don't know. But he smiled at me and he said, John, he said, the last will be first and the first will be last. And he said, in my Father's house are many mansions. And I go to prepare a place not only for you and your family, but also all of your friends. And he walked me towards the crowd. And as I got up to the crowd, lo and behold, he walked me right up to my mom and dad. And there's my dad. And I was like, oh my God, that's my dad. And he looked like he was, when my dad was in his, maybe 60s. And my mom was in her 50s. And she had that 1970s hair, And my dad he always used that dippity-doo stuff in his hair. And but anyway, I said, how you doing, Dad? And he said, pretty good for an old fella. He gave me the biggest hug. My mom, she was there and she said, oh, Johnny. And she gave me the biggest hug. And I could feel so much love. And in her right arm, she had my niece. The niece was Katie. And she had died from a diabetic coma when she was 9 years old, years ago. And she was there. And she said, hi, Uncle Johnny. And I got down and I looked at her and I said, Katie, I said, it's so nice to see you. And she gave me the biggest hug. And again, my heart just was overflowing with love inside. And as I walked up and down, I'm seeing people that are from my family, my aunts, my uncles, Aunt Helen, my Uncle Nick, he's real tall. I see my Aunt Mary Margaret, and I see her husband, and he died relatively early, but he's up there. And I saw, as I'm walking, I'm seeing all of these people. I ran into the person I was named after who died at Pearl Harbor, and his name was John Kyleman. And he still had his sailor suit on. He's like, you don't know who I am, do you? And I said, I think I do. I said, are you John Kyleman? And he said, yes, I'm your uncle. And I was freaking out, I was like, man, And everybody was giving me a hug, literally, everybody. I mean, it was Hug City up there, okay? I mean, it was great. I mean, I can't explain the love that I felt from all of these people. And as I got deeper into the crowd, I started running into people that were older. When I say older, I'm talking about early 20th century, late 19th century, where their clothing was different. It was a little odd, stuff I'd never seen before. And I walked up to this one fella, and he had a real nice suit on, but his tie was like looked like one of them Colonel Sanders ties, black. He had a black suit on, and he had a medal around his neck. And I said, what is that? He said, you don't know who I am, do you? He said, I'm your great, great, great grandfather. And I said, what? And he said, yeah. He said, my name's Andrew. It's nice to meet you. And he gave me the biggest hug. I said, that's a cool medal. Where'd you get that? And he said, I got that in the Civil War. He said, I fought for the Union. And that's the victory medal. And I was like, really? I mean, it just blew me away. But again, I want to emphasize, when I was up there, and I'm kind of feeling it now, I mean, the love that I felt was just, it was amazing. Everywhere, every person I touched, everything that, as I'm brushing my legs through the flowers, I mean, everything up there was giving the essence of love, kindness, compassion, and everybody was smiling and talking and having a good time. There was no pain or suffering or anything. It didn't appear as though there was any of that up there. As I went deeper into the crowd, I met a lot of folks that were further back in my generational genealogy, so to speak. And it was really bizarre because I ran into this one guy who was dressed, I don't know, maybe like the 1500s, and he was pushing a sausage cart. And I looked at him like, what's going on? And I could smell the sausage, They smelled really pungent, but smelled good, But I mean, his cart was just full of them. And he was trying to give me one. And he gave me the biggest hug. And he's talking in a dialect I didn't know. Sounded like maybe Hungarian or possibly Czechoslovakian, I don't know. But he was trying to give me one, and I waved my hand like I can't take that. I don't know why, but I said, I can't take that. And I gave him a big hug, and he smiled and went on his way. And further, there was a guy who was wearing vestments. He had like a bucket helmet on his head, and it had a cross right here. And he had a white tunic-like thing on, and it had a red cross right down the middle and comes this way, like a cross you would see, and it was white with a red cross. And he had a sword in his sheath, and he had like chain mail on his legs and arms. And I thought, man, he really stood out, in the crowd. And I asked one of my relatives, I said, who is that? They said, he probably fought in the crusade. He's related to you. And I didn't know that. I was freaking out. But anyway, as I went further, I ran into a lot of different people that I didn't know. Folks that I had no clue who they were. But they were apparently relation, because they were all giving me big hugs. It got to the point where I went back through the crowd and I caught up with Jesus, who was talking to a lot of folks. I said, Jesus, this is beautiful. My whole family's up here. Am I going to stay up here? And he said, no, John. He said, I wanted to talk to you. And I said, what's going on? He said, I'm going to send you back. And I said, why are you sending me back? Because I didn't want to leave, to be honest. And he said, I'm sending you back. He said, because there's too much hate in the world right now. He said, there's a lot of hate. He said, and I'm really, really not happy with that. He said, I want people to learn to love as I love them, the same love that the innocence of a child brings. That's exactly what he said. A 3-year-old child, that innocent love. He said, that's the way I want everyone to love one another. And I thought to myself, man, how am I going to do that? It's a crazy world down there. And so I told him, I said, what would you want me to do? And he said, I'm going to send you back, and you just tell people, love one another. He said, and pray for those that are your enemies. Tell them to pray for those that are your enemies. He said, because love conquers evil. He said, light conquers darkness. He said, and love is the most important thing. And he said, I know you feel that love now. He said, the Holy Spirit now runs through you. And he said, it's going to be easy for you to learn different languages. And he said, I'm going to send you back. And please, whatever you do, don't forget to spread this word that I'm telling you about love. Well, I felt overwhelmed. And I said, Jesus, who am I to do this? I said, I'm not worthy of this. Like I said, I'm a sinner. And he said, John, don't even worry about that. He said, when I died on the cross, all your sins were forgiven. And, I should point out also that I met a lot of interesting people up there too. I ran into St. Francis of Assisi, and he was very unique in that, of course, he was wearing a Franciscan robe, but he had his hands had wounds, and his feet had wounds. And he gave me the biggest hug, but I couldn't help but notice that his wounds were like glowing in his hands and in his feet. And it was the same thing when I ran into this guy who I didn't know that had that. I think they call it the stigmata. And he had that too. And then since I got back, I found out who that was. And that was this guy named Padre Pio. I didn't know who he was, but I found him by researching it. But anyway, he was up there. There were a lot of people up there. I want to point something out too. There was also people up there that were from every denomination, Christian denomination you can think of. And maybe some you probably couldn't think of. Now, I got to say that they were all relation, so I'm doubtful that any of them were Muslims or any of them were, Buddhists or whatever the case may be. But that's not to say that they're not up there. I don't know. I mean, I just don't know. All I know is that all my relation was up there, and they were the ones that greeted me when I got up there. And it was amazing that they were all together like that, and that they were all enjoying each other's company and hugging each other and talking to one another. It was like being at a family reunion again. But the family reunion went back hundreds of years. Finally, at what seemed like maybe 7-8 hours of meeting people, I finally got tired. And I laid down in the field, and it smelled so good. And I fell asleep. And when I woke up, I was in ICU. And I had a breathing apparatus in my throat. It was down my tracheal tube, I guess. And I looked over, and I was very weak. I remember that. And I looked over, because this was right in the height of COVID. And I looked over, and there's my daughter with a mask on and my son with a mask on. And they're both crying, looking through the window at me. And the love that I felt, I gave them a thumbs up. And they smiled at me. And I could see that they were smiling through their covering, their little N95 or whatever those things are. I felt really, really good. That's the only way I can explain it. And later on, and I went through a series of going to different medical institutions. Because of COVID, they transferred me out of that hospital. They sent me up to a hospital that didn't have COVID at the time, and that was in Portage, Indiana, Regency Hospital. And I had a doctor for basically every organ, and they worked on me and worked on me. I got my kidneys functioning properly. Cardiologist did like 5 echocardiograms on me. They really went to town on me. My lungs were looked at, they fixed that. They got my respiratory straightened out. They got my blood pressure straightened out with medicine. Pretty soon, I was sepsis free. And I felt like $1 million when I got out of surgery. Seriously.